From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. Today I'm going to be talking with Ken Pollack about his new book, Armies of Sand, The Past, Present, and Future of Arab Military Effectiveness. Ken is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where he works on Middle Eastern political military affairs, focusing in particular on Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states. He was previously at Brookings, the National Security Council, and the CIA, among other places. Ken, thank you for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me, Alistair.
To kick things off, can you give us a short, high-level overview of what the book is about?
Sure. The book is really about how Arab militaries have fought over the past 70 or so years, and in particular, why it is that they seem to have had so many problems in combat, why it is that so often Arab armies that looked like they should have won a war, or looked like going into a war would have won because of a whole variety of material advantages that they had nevertheless lost, and in other cases, even when they did win, managed to only eke out very narrow victories in circumstances when you might have again expected them, based on material factors, to have won an overwhelming victory.
What motivated you to write this book, and why now? This seems like something that you've been working on in one form or another for years.
This is a question that has fascinated me for at least 25 years, arguably all 30 that I've been working on the Middle East in the Washington policy arena. It's a critically important question. It underpins the entire Middle East military balance, which itself underpins the entire international relations of the Middle East. The fact that Israel has been so dominant, not only so safe for the past 40 or so years, but able to project power in ways that a small state might not otherwise have been had it faced stronger neighbors. The fact that the United States has also been able to project power so easily with so few forces in the region, but also that we've not been able to rely on our Arab allies the way that we have been able to rely on allies in other parts of the world. This is a critical issue, and it drives much of what goes on in the Middle East, often in kind of unseen ways, right? We just don't think about the fact that the Middle East military balance is what's responsible for so many other things going on, because it's just become part of the warp and woof of the Middle East. And that's obviously critical to understand, but I'm also concerned about it, and this gets to your question of why now, because I think that that era is probably starting to end. I think that we're actually beginning a new era. And I think that Arab military effectiveness, the ability of Arab states, Arab groups to employ force, I think is going to change. And that is going to dramatically change the politics, the international relations of the Middle East, again, in ways that we're not expecting, because we just don't think about how much what we've known about the international politics of the Middle East over the last 70 years has rested on this foundation of this very uneven, very unequal, but very stable military balance.
Before we delve into the details, can you explain for people in our audience who might not be military specialists what you mean when you're talking about military effectiveness?
Sure. And I think the easiest way to put it is how well they fight. Right? How well do they use their weapons? How well do they implement strategies? How well do they formulate new strategies and creative solutions to their military problems, right? We, always think about the material factors. And again, as Westerners, we've had a tendency to focus on material factors. How many tanks does one country have? How good are their airplanes, right? How sophisticated are their missiles? Whether they have surprise, whether they have weapons that the other side can't fight against. Western military analysis, especially during the Cold War, tended to focus on those measures. But the truth is that the more that you understand military history, the more that you realize that how well a group or a country employs its weaponry, how well it can handle a strategy or a set of tactics is far more important than just how much they have and how good the weapons are.
In the book, you explored 4 potential explanations for this phenomenon in the kind of limited effectiveness of Arab militaries in the post-World War II era. I'd like to kind of run through each of them in turn with you briefly and give you a chance to kind of explain and comment on them, starting with the reliance on Soviet military methods.
Sure. Well, this is something that you heard a lot about during the Cold War, and it's interesting because you still hear about it, especially from American military personnel, especially older officers who grew up during the Cold War facing the Russians. And there is this innate belief that the problems that the Arabs have had is because they were trained by the Russians. And this is the first explanation I look at, and the truth is it is just flat out wrong. It doesn't hold any water. First, Arab armies have the same sets of problems, whether they have been trained by the Russians, by us, by the British, by the French, by no one at all, right? The same patterns recur. And in fact, what you also see when you look hard at it is the Arab states don't really fight like the Russians. And in fact, I have a lot of stories in my book about how they used to drive the Russians crazy. Russians would try to teach them to do it their way, and the Arabs just wouldn't do it their way, drove the Russians nuts. So they didn't fight like the Russians. And in fact, if anything, the Arab armies tend to do better when they have a fair amount of Soviet training and backing behind them than they have in a lot of other circumstances.
The second point you explore is the poor state of civil-military relations.
Right. Now, this is an important one. And it's something that we've tended to focus on recently because increasingly people want to believe that the problems with the world are a result of bad politics. And there's no question that there are a lot of problems in the world that are a result of bad politics. And there's no question that some of the problems that the Arabs have been because of their poor civil-military relations. I mean, let's just be honest. The course of the last 70 years, 75 years in the Middle East, has been one of dictatorships and monarchies in most of the Arab states for most of this period of time. So they've largely been autocracies. And there are a bunch of different problems. Sometimes it's the military that is the dictator, right? And what you find is when militaries are running the government, they have no business doing that. And they don't know what they're doing, and it creates all kinds of problems for them. And you get into situations where you get generals who are fighting over issues like land reform, right? That's not something they should be doing, and that's not good for the kind of honing of a military edge. On other occasions, you have a dictator, whether it's a military officer or a civilian, who's very frightened that the military is going to overthrow them, right? And so they take tremendous steps to try to hobble the military to make sure that it doesn't overthrow them. And many of the things that they do to prevent a coup also inhibit military performance. Now there, what's interesting is that, again, this does play a role. And in some cases, it plays a very important role. But it mostly plays a role in terms of really producing bad Arab generals. Right? Because in many of these cases, what you get are governments that favor loyalty over competence. Now, the truth is, in most cases, they look for both, right? They want someone who's really smart and really loyal. But if they got to choose between the two, they go for loyal. Right? And in some extreme cases, like Saddam Hussein in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Saddam may have actually picked people because they were morons, right? Picked generals because they were fools in the expectation that they would have a harder time overthrowing him because they were so incapable. Right? Now, that's an extreme case, but you have seen that where you've had this extreme politicization, as we call it, of the militaries. You've had some very bad generals that have led to very poor strategic direction. In addition, in some cases, and again, I got to be careful because it's not uniform, but in some cases, this kind of politicization has also undercut morale and the cohesion of Arab units, right? If you've got, your soldiers and they know that they're being led by incompetent generals who are arguing about land reform rather than practicing for war, well, they may not be as confident going into battle, right? So there have been some issues, but what's interesting about that is that that's a problem that you tend to see in a lot of non-Arab politicized militaries, much more than you do with the Arabs. Right? In countries like South Vietnam and Argentina, right, you had enormous problems with morale and unit cohesion in their wars. The Arab states actually do better. And what it speaks to is that while politicization is present and it is having an impact, there's something else going on that's actually helpful to the Arabs.
The third explanation that you explore in the book is the underdevelopment of Arab states. Can you comment on that?
So if the new flavor of the month is politics are the problem, the older flavor of the month is that it's economics. Right? And especially for much of the Cold War and on beyond it, and still to a certain extent this day, there is this assumption that third world militaries just can't fight as well as first world militaries. And there is some reason to believe this is true. And in fact, it is the case that underdevelopment has affected Arab militaries over the course of time. Right? And the way to think about this is that the Industrial Revolution never really made it to the Middle East. There are certainly factories here and there, and obviously there are cars and machinery there, but it just never affected the Arab world. It never industrialized the way that Europe, North America, and eventually East Asia did. And if you grow up in a society where you don't have as much contact with machinery, cars, telephones, televisions, sewing machines, refrigerators, right? If you don't have that kind of constant contact with these machines and that constant familiarity and the need to accommodate your own lives and your own actions to the needs of machines, there's a tendency to not really understand how to get the most out of the machines, right? And during the industrial age of warfare, and the last 70 years have been the height of the industrial age of warfare, the machines drove the fighting. Right? I mean, think about it. In the last 70 years, over the last 100 years, the questions that we've asked when we've thought about wars is, who's got the most tanks? Who's got the most planes? Whose tanks are better? Whose planes are better? Right? It's really about the machines. If you come from a society that just hasn't had the same exposure to machinery, people don't know how to get as much from the machines. And we've certainly seen that in war after war after war in the Middle East, where Arab soldiers, Arab pilots, they just don't know how to get full advantage out of their tanks, out of their planes. And as a result, you can see Israelis or Americans operating machinery of similar kinds, in some cases even worse, right? Older machines. The Israelis in 1948, 56, and 67, they're often fighting with weapons that are a generation behind what the Arabs have, but the Israelis are just much better at using those weapons than the Arabs are. And so both the ability to use them and also the ability to maintain them, right? If you don't spend a lot of time with machines, you don't understand how much it takes to constantly maintain them, keep them up so that they are working. Right? And both of these problems have absolutely bedeviled Arab armies over time. So underdevelopment is also playing a role. And if you think about it, the politicization, that's mostly affecting the highest levels of the military. The underdevelopment is what's affecting the lowest levels of the military.
Though the maintenance issue is something that you really bring through in the book is quite interesting. It's something that as a non-military person, I don't really think about, but is obviously hugely important when you come to, it turns out you've got 100 tanks and only 50 of them work. Not going to do you a whole lot of good. The last issue that you explore, the last potential explanation, is the issue of culture and kind of patterns of behavior. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. And look, I need to be careful about this, Alistair, because this is obviously a very, very touchy topic. And that's why I spent a lot of time and space in the book going through all the caveats, what it means to talk about culture, what it is, what it isn't, the fact that it is not timeless, that it is constantly changing, the fact that, this is not a judgment about Arab society. Every society has culture. Culture is extremely important. And your culture is simply something that evolves over time in response to your environment, right? It works. In a Darwinian sense, it is what has worked best to allow your society to survive. But cultures do things in very different ways. They teach people to behave in very different ways. And in particular, every society has organizations, hierarchies, right? It's a hallmark of civilization that every society has these hierarchies, these organizations. But every culture teaches people to operate in these hierarchies in different ways. Some are very top-down, some are very bottom-up, some are inside-out, right? There are different ideas about how people in different parts of an organization are supposed to behave toward one another. And again, these all work fine in their particular circumstances. The problem for the Arabs is that warfare is a competitive activity. And so while their organizations work fine for themselves in their own environment, the issue is when you're fighting the organizations, the militaries of another society, now the question becomes whose organization does better at one particular thing, fighting wars. Right? And that's not something that's relative to each culture. That's an absolute. Right? And different cultures fight in ways that at different points in time are more or less conducive to warfare. Right? So just think about how over the course of history, we have seen societies, countries, civilizations that seem to punch above their weight, like Sparta or the Mongols, and others that didn't punch as well. Right? Russia at different points in time, where again, if you just looked at the material balance, you might have thought that the Russians should have been stronger at different points in time. Right? Same thing, the Spartans, you'd look at them and say, boy, they're not any more populous or any richer than Athens, but the Spartan Phalanx was the best of the ancient world. And what this really speaks to is about how cultures teach people to operate in different environments. And the best way I can describe it is during the industrial age, Arab society had a very top-down method of running its organizations. Again, it's a method that worked fine for them, but it was severely top-down. All ideas, all initiative, all creativity, all of that came from the top and went down, and people at the bottom of a hierarchy were not supposed to think for themselves. They were simply supposed to react. The problem that they faced is that 20th century warfare, industrial age warfare, demanded the exact opposite. You had to have large numbers of people at the bottom of your chain of command, middle managers, the sergeants, captains, lieutenants, majors, right, who were the core of any industrial age military, who had to be able to think for themselves, seize fleeting opportunities, react to very quickly changing circumstances on the battlefield. That's what let you win in industrial age warfare, right? This is what the Germans, the Wehrmacht, taught the world. This is why the Israelis succeeded, because their societies produced large numbers of people who functioned well in that environment. In the 20th century, Arab society conditioned its personnel to mostly function in the opposite fashion. So again, if politicization created problems at the top of Arab military hierarchies and underdevelopment created problems for Arab militaries at the lowest levels, kind of the enlisted personnel levels, Arab culture, the way that it had evolved over the generations, created very severe problems for the middle range of Arab hierarchies, the field-grade officers, the middle managers of Arab militaries, which during the industrial age was the key. That's where you had to be great to be able to win. That's why the Germans and the Israelis were so successful. It's why the Arabs were so consistently unsuccessful.
Switching gears a little bit to talk about non-state actors, and this is something that you get into later on in the book. There are some, and I'm thinking most prominently of Hezbollah here, but also some of the more recent ones like ISIS come to mind as well, that really seem to outperform the conventional state militaries. Why is that?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's why I have a whole chapter on it in my book, and I look hard at both Hezbollah and ISIS as examples of it. There are a lot of different things going on there. And first, there are just some very conventional advantages that groups like Hezbollah and ISIS have. For instance, they bring tremendous zeal to the fight, right? They are fired by this kind of religious enthusiasm. They believe that they're waging jihad, right? That's always helpful if you've got that kind of a commitment in your troops going into battle. But then they also have a range of factors where they get around, in particular, some of these culturally derived problems. First, they've got some advantages. As my friend Mike Eisenstadt and Catherine Bianchi have pointed out, both Hezbollah and ISIS take advantage of the very strong interpersonal bonds of Arab society, right? That is a benefit that they derive from their culture. It's one of the reasons we were talking earlier about how actually Arab morale and unit cohesion is often better than you'd expect in politicized military. Well, this is one of the reasons, because Arab in-group solidarity can be incredibly strong, right? And Hezbollah and ISIS deliberately try to build that by recruiting family members into the same units, right? So they take advantage of that. But the last thing, and I would argue the most important, is Both Hezbollah and ISIS and a number of other groups, the Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda, a number of these other non-state actors, they started out as terrorist groups. And remember, terrorist groups always have a cellular structure, right? Which means you've got small units that are designed to act independently. They can't work together with others, right? So it's a very different kind of organization than a traditional Arab hierarchy. And then they go looking for the kind of people who can function well in that kind of structure. And let's also remember that, whatever you may believe, the average Arab doesn't join ISIS, doesn't join Al-Qaeda, frankly, doesn't join Hezbollah. These are exceptional people, right? They're different from the norm. In many cases, they may be less like the cultural norm. So Hezbollah, ISIS, these other groups, they have a different kind of an organization that acts in a different way than the traditional Arab organization, and they deliberately go looking for people who can function well and then train those people. Right? So it's a completely different cultural experience than what you see in the Arab militaries, and that is why they have consistently performed somewhat, and we need to be careful, but they have performed somewhat better. And I think that that is a sign of what may be coming in the Arab world.
So surely this issue, kind of writ large, is important for Arab militaries, number one, because they have an obvious vested interest in their performance. But if you're sitting at the Pentagon or at the State Department here in D.C., why is this issue important to you?
Sure. Well, a couple of reasons. First one is the U.S. has been trying to train Arab militaries since the 1950s. Right? We have a number of very important Arab allies, and the truth is their importance has been growing over time. You can make an argument, I used to make this argument, that the U.S. really didn't care if our Arab allies actually knew how to fly the F-16 or knew how to employ the M1 tank, because the truth was we would be there to do it for them. And mostly all we cared about was that they had a bunch of F-16 spare parts on hand and the ammunition for the M1 so that when we got there, we could use it. Well, that's no longer the case, especially over the last 15 or 20 years. The U.S. really has been relying on them, whether it's because for political reasons, like with the ISIS war, we didn't want to employ our own troops, right? We wanted to use the Iraqi army and the Syrian opposition to fight ISIS instead of our own troops, or because, truth be told, the U.S. would really like to get out of the Middle East a lot more and not be involved in these wars at all. But nevertheless, we don't want to leave behind a security vacuum that Iran, Hezbollah, ISIS, Al-Qaeda can fill because they will be squaring off against Arab militaries that can't fight back. Right? What we want is to leave behind strong Arab allies. And the problem that we've had for the last 60 years has been that our Arab allies have not been able to fight as well as we would have liked because of this set of societal problems. And we've got to overcome them. And then, of course, the last reason is the first thing that I mentioned, which is at the end of the day, the military balance in the Middle East has been driven for 70 years by this massive imbalance, by the weakness of the Arab states compared to the tremendous capability of the Israelis, the United States, and to a lesser extent, Iran as well. And the more that that changes over the course of time, the more it's going to destabilize the Middle East, right, in ways that, again, we're not even thinking about because we've just gotten so used to having this unequal military balance.
So now that you've laid out the problems, do you have any thoughts on how this issue could be addressed going forward?
There are certainly some things that the U.S. could be doing a little bit better when it comes to training our Arab allies, and it really comes down to recognizing some of the limitations they have, but also some of the strengths, relying more on the strengths to try to get around the limitations. And it's things like, you can build some pretty competent elite Arab formations, right? You go looking for the best, and they're always good, smart guys who know how to function in modern industrial warfare, right? You go and you pick them out and you put them into elite formations, rely on them. That's exactly what the U.S. did with the Iraqi Counterterrorism Service in 2014 to this very day, right? We picked out the best soldiers and officers, put them in one place, and we got a small, pretty competent force that we were able to work with. That's one approach. Another approach is to recognize that while the Arabs really can't do some things like they can't do air-to-air warfare, and they're really not good at maneuver warfare, right? Unstructured, mechanized, combined arms warfare, not good at that. they're pretty good at static defensive operations. They're not bad when it comes to set-piece offensives. And to the extent we can take advantage of that as well, we can get something going. Those are kind of short-term ways of thinking about it. But what we also have to be thinking about is the longer term. Right? And the longer term is that the Arab world is changing. And it is changing dramatically. And it's, again, one of the dangers. Whenever I start talking about culture, Americans assume that, culture is timeless, it's endless, it's been this way since the Middle Ages, it's going to be this way forever. It's not. Culture changes. It changes at the pace of generations, but it's always changing. And right now, I would argue that the Arab world is going through a pretty rapid transformation. Culturally, politically, economically. We would not have had the Arab Spring in 2011 30 years earlier, right? Arab society was not in that mode, but you were seeing the changes as a result of their own unhappiness with their circumstances, as a result of globalization, and as a result of the information revolution. And that's the last piece. Just as Arab society is changing dramatically, so is warfare changing dramatically. And information age warfare is probably going to be completely different from industrial age warfare. And the skills that were required to succeed in industrial age combat could be completely different for information age combat. Right? And so the point that I've been making in this book is, look, during the 20th century, during the industrial age, the Arabs were at a real disadvantage because there was a real mismatch. The skills that their society generated weren't perfectly suited. In many cases, they just didn't generate enough of those skills to take advantage of what you needed to succeed in industrial age warfare. But we've got a new Arab society that is dawning on us and a new age of warfare. And what we don't know is how will the skills generated by that future Arab society line up with the skills required of future information age warfare.
We'll have to leave it there, but again, this is a huge book, and we've only just scratched the surface, so if you're interested in learning more, do pick up a copy. Ken, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Alistair.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in, and to our production team for their work on today's program. We'll see you all next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.